Nobody slaps a woman who spent 12 years learning how to make people disappear. But that is exactly what happened at the Harrington Gala, in front of 400 guests, under chandeliers worth more than most people's homes. The woman who threw the slap was wearing a designer gown. The woman who received it was carrying a tray of champagne glasses. One of them believed she was the most powerful person in the room. The other had been trained by governments to become invisible. The slap landed. What happened next did not just end an engagement. It destroyed a carefully built lie that had survived for over a decade. And by the time the last guest walked out of that gala, every single person understood one terrifying truth. The most dangerous woman at the party was never the one wearing diamonds. It was the one no one bothered to notice. Hit that like button right now and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop your country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of the most intense I have ever shared on this channel. It is about power, deception, and what happens when someone pushes the wrong person one step too far. Stay until the very end, because the final twist will completely change how you see everything that came before it. Her name was Elena Voss, 31 years old, and for the past 14 months, she had worked as a live-in maid at the Harrington estate, a sprawling penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential towers. She wore a simple gray and white uniform every day, kept her dark hair pulled back in a neat braid, and moved through the rooms of that penthouse so quietly that most people forgot she was even there. That was not an accident. That was training. Before Elena Voss learned how to fold napkins into perfect roses, she learned how to read a room in under 3 seconds. Before she memorized which guest preferred oat milk and which one needed exactly 2 ice cubes in their bourbon, she memorized floor plans of buildings in countries most Americans could not find on a map. Before she became the kind of woman people looked straight through without a second thought, she was the kind of woman who walked into rooms that most people never walked out of. But nobody at the Harrington estate knew any of that. To them, she was just Elena, quiet, polite, invisible. The maid who never complained, never asked questions, and always had Mr. Harrington's coffee ready at exactly 5:45 every morning. And that was exactly how she wanted it. The man she worked for was Daniel Harrington, 35 years old. The sole heir to a pharmaceutical empire his grandfather had founded 60 years ago, and his father had expanded into one of the largest private companies on the East Coast. Daniel was not what most people expected when they heard the word billionaire. He was quiet. He was careful with his words. He remembered the names of every single person who worked in his household, and he never once raised his voice at any of them. Most nights, long after the rest of the staff had gone home, Daniel would sit alone at the kitchen island with a glass of whiskey, staring at financial reports he did not want to read. And Elena, finishing her last tasks of the evening, would move quietly around him, wiping counters, organizing shelves, saying nothing unless he spoke first. But he always spoke first. "Do you ever feel like the life you are living is not the one you were supposed to have?" he asked her one night, his voice low and tired, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for far too long. Elena paused for just a moment before answering. "Every single day, Mr. Harrington." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something flickered behind his eyes. Not curiosity exactly, but recognition. The kind of recognition that only happens between two people who understand what it means to hide who they really are. Those late-night conversations became routine. Never planned, never acknowledged during the day, but always there. Waiting. Like a door neither of them was ready to walk through, but neither of them could bring themselves to close. Then there was Vivian Cole, 33 years old. Daniel's fiancée of 2 years, and a woman who had been raised in a world where people like Elena existed only to serve and stay silent. Vivian came from old money, Connecticut boarding schools, European summers, the kind of upbringing that taught a person to smile beautifully while looking down at everyone beneath them. She was stunning in the way a glass sculpture is stunning. Perfect from a distance, sharp enough to cut you up close if you were not careful. From the very first week Elena started working at the penthouse, Vivian made her position clear without ever saying it directly. She would leave clothes on the floor 2 steps away from the hamper. She would ring the service bell 4 times in a row if Elena took more than 30 seconds to respond. She would speak about the staff in the third person while they stood right in front of her, as if they were furniture that happened to breathe. Elena endured all of it, not because she lacked the ability to respond, but because she had made a promise to herself a long time ago. A promise written in blood she never wanted to see again. Before the gray uniform and the quiet life, Elena Voss had been someone else entirely. A woman with a different name, a different purpose, and a set of skills that most people only encountered in classified files they were never supposed to read. She had spent 12 years embedded in covert operations across 3 continents, recruited straight out of a federal training program at the age of 18. She could disarm a man twice her size in under 2 seconds. She could memorize a 40-page document after reading it once. She could disappear in a crowded room so completely that even the people standing next to her would swear she had never been there at all. But 3 years ago, after an operation that went wrong in ways she still could not talk about without her hands starting to shake, Elena walked away. She buried her old identity, her old name, her old life, and she chose something no one in her former world would have ever predicted. Silence. Stillness. A life where no one looked at her twice. Becoming a maid was not a failure. It was the most deliberate decision she had ever made. A conscious choice to use her hands for folding linens instead of breaking bones. To exist in rooms without ever needing to control them. To finally, after years of being a weapon someone else pointed, become a person again. But peace has a way of becoming fragile when someone starts pressing on it. Vivian had begun watching Elena more closely over the past few months. Not openly, but in the quiet, calculating way that jealous people observe the things they cannot quite understand. She noticed how Daniel's posture changed when Elena entered a room, how his voice dropped half a tone softer when he spoke to her, how he laughed more easily at midnight in his own kitchen than he ever did at any dinner party Vivian had spent weeks organizing. It was not jealousy at first. It was something worse. It was the slow, creeping realization that her fiancé felt more at home with the help than he did with the woman he had asked to marry him. One evening, Vivian was reviewing the household staff files in Daniel's study when she noticed something that made her pause. Elena's employment records were clean, almost too clean. References checked out perfectly. Work history was consistent. But there was a gap. 4 years between her 22nd and 26th birthday where nothing existed. No jobs, no addresses, no records of any kind. Just empty space. Vivian did not mention the gap to anyone. She simply filed it away in her mind the way a predator files away the scent of something it does not yet understand but fully intends to hunt. From that day forward, her treatment of Elena shifted from casual cruelty to something far more deliberate. She was no longer just dismissing the maid. She was testing her. Small provocations at first. Asking Elena to re-iron a dress that was already perfectly pressed. Calling her into a room just to hand her an empty glass that could have been placed on any table. Making her stand and wait during long phone calls before finally saying, "Never mind, you can go." Elena absorbed every single test without flinching. Her face remained calm, her posture steady, her voice polite and even, and that, more than anything else, was what drove Vivian mad. Because most people, when pushed hard enough, eventually crack. They roll their eyes. They sigh. They let something slip through the mask, even if it is only for a second. Elena never cracked. Not once. And Vivian could not figure out why. There is something off about her, Vivian told her closest friend Morgan over lunch at a restaurant on the Upper East Side, stirring her drink without looking up. Nobody is that calm. Nobody takes that much without reacting unless they are hiding something. Morgan raised an eyebrow. She is a maid, Viv. Maybe she just needs the job. No, Vivian said firmly. It is something else. I can feel it. She was right. But the truth behind Elena's composure was something Vivian's sheltered world could never have prepared her for. Elena was not calm because she was weak. She was calm because she had once been trained to sit perfectly still in a room full of armed men and control her heartbeat until the moment she needed to move. A woman like Vivian raising her voice was not pressure. It was background noise. 2 weeks before the gala, the tension between them reached a breaking point. Vivian found Elena in the hallway outside the master bedroom, arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase, the way she did every Tuesday morning. "I want you to know something," Vivian said, stepping close enough that Elena could smell her perfume. "After the gala, I am restructuring the entire household staff, and your name is at the top of the list." Elena placed the last stem carefully into the vase before turning to face her. "I understand, Miss Cole." "Do you? Because you do not look like someone who understands how easily she can be replaced." Elena held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. "I have been replaced before, Miss Cole. It is never as simple as people think." Vivian walked away without another word, but the look on her face said everything her mouth did not. She had expected fear. She had expected submission. Instead, she had received something that unsettled her far more than defiance ever could. She had received stillness. That night, long after Vivian had gone to bed, Daniel found Elena in the kitchen. She was standing by the window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, her reflection ghosted against the glass like a woman caught between 2 versions of herself. "She threatened you again, didn't she?" Daniel asked quietly, leaning against the doorframe. Elena did not turn around. "It is not a threat if it does not change anything." "It changes things for me," Daniel said, his voice carrying a weight he rarely let anyone hear. "I do not want you to leave, Elena." She finally turned to face him. "You are getting married in 3 months, Mr. Harrington. What you want and what is appropriate are 2 very different things." He opened his mouth to respond, but she was already walking past him, her footsteps barely making a sound against the marble floor. He stood alone in that kitchen for a long time after she left, and somewhere in the silence, he understood something he had been avoiding for months. The woman he looked forward to seeing every night was not the one sleeping in his bedroom. It was the one who disappeared down the hallway without looking back. The Harrington Gala arrived on a cold Saturday evening in late November. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Harrington Foundation's private building on 5th Avenue, a cathedral-sized room with 30-foot ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, and chandeliers imported from a palace in Vienna that had taken 4 months to install. 400 guests filled the space. Senators, tech founders, old money families, hedge fund managers, a few carefully selected journalists, and enough combined net worth to fund a small country. Vivian had spent 6 months planning every detail, every seating arrangement, every lighting cue, every musical transition. This was her night, her stage, her moment to stand beside Daniel Harrington and show the world exactly who she was. Elena arrived 3 hours before the first guest, along with the rest of the catering staff. She wore the standard black and white service uniform, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression composed and professional. She had told herself the same thing every hour since she woke up that morning. Stay invisible. Do your job. Do not give her a reason. But fate does not care about the promises we make to ourselves, especially when someone else has already decided to break them for us. The gala moved like clockwork for the first 2 hours. Guests mingled, champagne circulated, and Vivian floated through the room like a woman who had been born for exactly this kind of evening. She smiled at the right people, laughed at the right jokes, and held Daniel's arm with the kind of practiced grace that made their relationship look effortless from the outside. Elena stayed near the edges, carrying trays, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates. She moved through the crowd the way she had been trained to move through far more dangerous rooms. Unnoticed, unremembered, a ghost with a serving tray. Everything changed at exactly 9:15. Daniel was standing near the center of the ballroom, giving an impromptu toast to a group of foundation donors, when his eyes drifted across the room and landed on Elena. It lasted only a second, maybe less, but his expression softened in a way that 400 people could have missed. But the one person who was always watching did not. Vivian saw it, and something inside her that had been cracking for months finally shattered completely. She crossed the ballroom floor with a speed that made several guests step out of her way instinctively. Her heels struck the marble like gunshots. Her jaw was tight, her eyes locked onto Elena with the kind of focus that leaves no room for reason. Elena saw her coming. Every instinct she had buried for 3 years screamed at her to react, to prepare, to shift her weight and position her hands the way she had done 1,000 times before in situations far more dangerous than this one. Instead, she stood still. She held the tray steady. She told herself this was not a battlefield. This was a ballroom. But Vivian did not care about the difference. She reached Elena, grabbed the tray from her hands, and hurled it sideways. Crystal glasses exploded against the marble floor, sending champagne and broken glass scattering across the feet of a dozen stunned guests. The string quartet stopped playing. Conversations died mid-sentence. 400 pairs of eyes turned toward the center of the room. "I have had enough of you," Vivian said, her voice loud enough to echo off the 30-foot ceilings. "Everyone in this room can see what you are doing. The looks, the late nights, the way you think you can just exist in his life like you belong here." Elena said nothing. Her hands were empty now. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes were locked on Vivian's with a calm so absolute that it made several nearby guests visibly uncomfortable. And then Vivian slapped her. Open palm, full force directly across the face. The sound cut through the ballroom like a crack of thunder. 400 guests gasped in unison. Several women covered their mouths. A senator near the front row physically stepped backward. The slap echoed off the chandeliers and bounced across the marble walls, hanging in the air like a sentence that could never be taken back. Elena's head turned slightly from the impact. A thin red mark bloomed across her left cheek. For exactly 2 seconds, she did not move, did not breathe, did not blink. And in those 2 seconds, something happened behind her eyes that only a handful of people on the planet would have recognized. The woman who folded napkins and carried trays quietly stepped aside. And the woman who had spent 12 years walking into the most dangerous rooms in the world stepped forward. Vivian, fueled by the adrenaline of her audience and the silence she mistook for submission, raised her hand again, this time aiming for the other cheek harder, faster, determined to make this maid crumble in front of everyone who mattered. It never landed. Elena's hand came up so fast that 3 guests standing closest would later swear they did not actually see it move. She caught Vivian's wrist mid-swing with a grip that was not violent but absolutely immovable. The kind of grip that communicated one very simple thing. This is over. Vivian's eyes went wide. She tried to pull her hand back and could not. She tried to twist free and felt her entire body shift off balance instead. Elena had not squeezed. She had not pulled. She had simply redirected Vivian's own momentum with a movement so precise and controlled that it looked like something rehearsed for a stage. In one fluid motion, Elena stepped to the side, guided Vivian's arm in a smooth arc, and swept her feet from under her with a single controlled motion of her ankle. Vivian's designer heels left the marble floor entirely. Her body rotated once in the air, suspended for a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity to everyone watching, before landing flat on her back on the polished ballroom floor with a sound that echoed across the entire room. Not a single glass broke. Not a single guest was touched. The movement had been so clean, so surgical, so impossibly precise that it did not look like violence at all. It looked like physics. Like gravity had simply decided to remind Vivian Cole where she belonged. Elena stood over her, breathing steady, posture straight, the red mark still visible on her cheek. 400 of the most powerful people in New York stood frozen in absolute silence, staring at the maid who had just moved like something out of a classified training video. Vivian lay on the floor, her gown twisted around her legs, her hair falling loose from its perfectly styled updo. She stared up at Elena with an expression that had moved beyond humiliation into something closer to terror. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking in front of 400 witnesses. Elena did not answer immediately. She took one slow breath, then extended her hand downward. Not as a threat, as an offer. Vivian flinched, swatting the hand away and scrambling backward across the marble floor like a woman who had just realized she had been living in the same house as something she never understood. Daniel pushed through the frozen crowd, his face a mixture of shock and something else entirely. Something that looked like every unanswered question he had ever had about this woman suddenly clicking into place at once. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Who are you? She turned to face him, and for the first time in 14 months, the mask she had worn so carefully every single day finally came down. Not with anger, not with pride, but with the quiet exhaustion of a woman who was tired of carrying a secret that weighed more than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. My real name is not Elena Voss, she said, her voice steady but soft enough that the entire ballroom leaned forward to hear. I was recruited into a federal covert operations program when I was 18 years old. I spent 12 years in deep cover assignments across 9 countries. I have worked under 6 different names. I have been in rooms that most people in this building do not even know exist. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute that the hum of the chandeliers above became audible. 3 years ago, she continued, an operation I was leading went wrong. People I was responsible for protecting got hurt. I walked away from that life because I could not carry the weight of it anymore. I came here because I wanted something I had never been allowed to have before. A normal life. A quiet life. A life where nobody needed me to be dangerous. She paused, looking directly at Vivian, who was still sitting on the floor, mascara streaking down both cheeks. I never wanted anyone to know. I never wanted this moment. But I will not stand in a room full of people and let someone strike me across the face simply because she decided that my uniform made me less than human. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not of scandal, not of judgment, but of something far more rare in a room full of powerful people. Genuine, undeniable respect. For a long moment, nobody moved. The ballroom remained suspended in a silence so heavy it felt like the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Then a voice broke through from the front of the crowd. Calm, measured, and carrying the kind of authority that only decades of power can produce. I saw everything. The crowd parted slightly to reveal Margaret Harrington, Daniel's grandmother. 89 years old, silver-haired, and sharper than half the lawyers in that room combined. She had built the Harrington Foundation from a single charity event 40 years ago into one of the most respected philanthropic organizations on the East Coast. When Margaret Harrington spoke, people listened. Not because they wanted to, but because they knew better than not to. She stepped forward slowly, her cane tapping against the marble with a rhythm that commanded the room more effectively than any microphone ever could. This young woman, Margaret said, gesturing toward Elena with a steady hand, was assaulted in front of 400 witnesses. She responded with more restraint than anyone I have ever seen in my life. She could have done far worse. She chose not to, and that choice tells me everything I need to know about her character. She turned to Vivian, who had finally pulled herself to her feet, but looked nothing like the polished woman who had walked into the gala 3 hours earlier. And you, Miss Cole, Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a tone that was almost gentle but cut deeper than any shout ever could, have spent 2 years in this family treating the people who take care of our home as if they were beneath your shoes. I stayed silent because my grandson asked me to. That silence ends tonight. Vivian's face crumbled. She looked desperately toward Daniel, searching for the defense she had always expected him to provide. But Daniel was not looking at her. He was looking at Elena. I think you already know what I am about to say, Daniel said quietly, his eyes still on Elena but his words clearly meant for Vivian. Daniel, you cannot do this. Vivian's voice trembled with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Not here. Not in front of all these people. I am your fiancé. You were my fiancé, Daniel replied, finally turning to face her. But the woman I just watched assault a member of my household in front of 400 guests because she was threatened by kindness is not someone I want to build a life with. I am sorry, Vivian, but I think we both know this has been over for a long time. Vivian stared at him for 3 endless seconds. Then, without a single word, she turned and walked out of the ballroom. The heavy doors closed behind her with a sound that felt less like an ending and more like a lock finally clicking open. The ballroom exhaled. 400 guests stood in the quiet aftermath of something none of them had expected to witness, and none of them would ever forget. Daniel turned to Elena, who stood exactly where she had been standing throughout the entire confrontation. Steady, still, the red mark on her cheek already fading, but the weight behind her eyes heavier than anything she had carried in years. I wish you had told me, he said softly. If I had told you, Elena replied, you would have seen the spy first and the person second. I have lived that life before. I was not willing to live it again. He nodded slowly, understanding something that most people spend their entire lives never learning. That the bravest thing a strong person can do is choose to be seen as ordinary. In the weeks that followed, the engagement was formally dissolved. Vivian left New York without a public statement, relocating to Europe to escape the whispers that followed her through every social circle she had once dominated. The story of what happened at the Harrington Gala traveled not through tabloids or gossip columns, but through the quiet, genuine respect of the people who had witnessed it firsthand. Elena expected to be let go. Instead, Daniel asked her to stay. Not as a maid, not as anything she did not want to be, simply as herself. Their relationship grew slowly over the following months, built not on drama or spectacle, but on the same foundation it had always rested upon. Late-night conversations, mutual respect, and the rare comfort of being truly known by another person. But Elena's greatest chapter was not about romance. With Daniel's support, she founded a training program for young women leaving difficult circumstances. Not combat training, confidence training, teaching them how to stand in a room full of people who underestimate them and never once doubt their own worth. Strength is not about what your hands can do, she told her first class of 15 young women. Strength is about what your silence can carry. It is knowing exactly who you are, even when the entire world has decided you are no one. If the story stayed with you tonight, if it reminded you that quiet strength will always outlast cruelty, then hit that like button, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they matter exactly as they are. Because the world is full of people like Elena. You just have to look past the uniform to see them.